Okay, hello, we are group 3 and our presentation is going to be on bilingualism. It is me, Karina, Dariana, Millie, and Katie. So we're going to dive into second language acquisition in childhood. We're going to start with the course of second language acquisition in childhood. It's when children first move to a new language community. They appear to go through stages of using different communicative strategies before they are able to communicate in the new language. They may go through a nonverbal period in which they communicate through gesture. Then they start to use the new language, but often what children can produce at this first stage of new language use consists of memorized phrases that serve social purposes. Only later do children start to use the new language productively. The differences between the inner language and the new language are the source of the errors second language learners make. Some of these errors appear to be like the errors monolingual children make in the course of acquisition. This course of development may take years. And then the next part is the process of second language acquisition in childhood. Second language acquisition in childhood might also proceed differently and have a more variable outcome than first language acquisition because the input conditions are different and highly variable. There's also influences on second language acquisition in childhood, and we have characteristics of children that influence second language learning. It's specific linguistics ability, personality traits, and age of acquisition.
Hi, so I am going to talk about social circumstances of childhood bilingualism. There is bilingualism all around the world, but the only thing that bilinguals of different languages or even the same language have in common is that they are able to speak 2 or more languages. How they acquire a second language is very different for everyone. I will explain 2 types of language input. One is simultaneous bilingualism, and the other one is sequential bilingualism. For each, I'll only provide one example, but there are many different circumstances for these types of language input. Simultaneous bilingualism is acquired from birth. For example, there is a family that lives in the United States. Parent 1 speaks English, which is the national language, since it's the language used in the government, at schools, etc. Parent 2 speaks a foreign language, for example, Chinese. The child learned both languages from birth. But the difference is that for Chinese, the only source of input is parent number 2. For English, the source of input is almost everywhere. To summarize this, one parent speaks a foreign language, but that's the only source of input for that child. Then there is sequential bilingualism. And this happens when a second language is introduced after the acquisition of the first language. For example, immigrating to a new country. I'll put myself as an example. I grew up in Tijuana, and the only language we spoke at home was Spanish. And when I was 14, I came to the United States with my family, and I had to learn English at school and with society. These are 2 types of social circumstances of childhood bilingualism. You can go to the next slide. These are the circumstances for childhood bilingualism. And these are so varied that there is no specific pattern or a specific way to acquire a second or multiple languages. Thank you.
And for my part, I will be talking about the bilingual brain. So there is no clear research on what parts of the brain are monolingualist and bilingualist, but there is a certain feature called effective functions where the brain adapts to the brain's regions where pathways are used for cognitive processes. And this function helps with attention control, reasoning, and problem solving. Alongside no full information on where monolingualism and bilingualism comes from, there are parts of the brain that show where it separates itself in a sense of where you understand, where you respond, and where you control the brain. So there is a diversity of use which is the adaptive controls of hypothesis, where the single language and dual language and code switching happens. There's a second part, which is language switching, which is the conditional routing models, which is the routing of information. The relative proficiency of bilingualism happens in the bilingual anterior to posterior and subcortical shift, which increases the reliance on the BAPSS and decreases the frontal regions. And the last part of the brain is the duration of use, which is the peak of efficiency. And those are the four main parts of the brain that shows where bilingualism happens, but not the exact part where monolingualism and bilingualism separate.
Hi, I'm Katie Sargent, and I'm going to be talking about types of language differentiation. Language differentiation refers to the way in which bilingual children differentiate between their two languages. For simultaneous bilinguals, that is, children learning two languages simultaneously, this can pose a problem. There are three linguistic hypotheses that explain how children may differentiate between their two languages. In interdependent differentiation, children separate the two languages, but the languages influence each other as the child learns them. In autonomous differentiation, children separate the languages and they acquire each of the languages separately. In the hypothesis of fusion, at first, children do not separate the different languages, but rather fuse them into one language, and differentiation occurs later. There are three other types of differentiation: phonological differentiation, where bilingual infants can differentiate between their two languages, but they do not show a preference for one over the other. A study from 2010 found that infants can understand and discriminate both languages from the same individual, meaning that they don't need one person to speak one language and another person to speak another language in order to understand that they're two separate languages. Monolingual infants who speak one language, learn to discriminate their native language in the first 12 months, while bilingual infants learn to do this with both languages. In lexical differentiation, bilingual children create two different vocabularies at the same time. 30 to 50% of these vocabularies can consist of translation equivalents for their two languages. Bilingual students apply the word learning strategy of mutual exclusivity to both languages, allowing them to accept multiple names for the same item. So where it might be confusing for a monolingual student to accept multiple names for the same item, it's easier for a bilingual student because they understand that it's two different languages. In morphosyntactic differentiation, bilingual children create separate morphosyntactic systems. But as with bilingual adults, they do mix words and morphemes from both languages in the same sentence. This mixing still respects the rules of both languages, and children tailor their use of morphosyntactic mixing depending on who they're speaking to. Right.